Hello everyone, today we talk about Manfred of Sicily and the Swabian legacy, and more in particular of Manfred's Italian policy before his demise, and we will see in later videos essentially the Angevin takeover by Charles of Anjou in Sicily, eventually the unfortunate expedition of Conradin, and probably the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty in male line. And looking, however, at this figure, Manfred, natural son of Frederick II, who played a very important role, not just in fact in the Kingdom of Sicily, but all over communal Italy and also internationally in Greece, in Mediterranean broadly meant, considering his connections also with Aragon and the contrast, with the Papacy and his French, the French allies, and in order essentially to make a power policy, right, in Italy, presenting himself as essentially the continuator, in fact, of the Imperial legacy, of backing the Ghibelline party, and coming close essentially to what eventually the same Angevins would have consolidated instead from a wealth perspective in the same Italy, hegemonizing essentially the whole region up to the expedition of Henry VII. So this figure is underestimated because of, in fact, the enormous power that at some point was able to leverage as we've seen in a situation where the king of the Romans, Conrad, Manfred's half brother and probably successor Frederick II, had died. Some say because of the same Manfred that fundamentally had you know what happened. We talked about yesterday. Conrad, after having settled the German affairs in a more or less stable way, embarked in Venice for Sicily. It took it over. He restrained his half brother, stripping him essentially of all the titles that he had assumed after Frederick II's death, except for the Principality of Taranto, but that was still kind of a insulting condition. So eventually Guelph historiography that was quite active in these years wrote a lot of chronicles and so on, invented the fact that fabricated the fact that Frederick II had been helped in dying by the same Manfred, which is surely not true, but that the same Conrad actually was killed by Manfred, which is possible, right? It was said that it was killed by a poison subministrated by the same Manfred agents and so on. This is more likely, at least, because of course there was an important tension in Sicily during Conrad's let's say rule. As we've seen, he had tried to convince the Papacy of the goodness of his intentions, but the Papacy absolutely wanted to maintain the kingdoms of Germany and Sicily separated, and also the same, Conrad hadn't fundamentally been able to this because he had gotten the support of those Sicilian barons that were actually against the Papacy in that situation. That there was an underlying conflict between these powers, if anything, because they also bordered with each other. Aside from the danger posed by the dynastic sum of Germany, Italy, and Sicily, properly the Sicilian kingdom was a pretty strong agent, kind of literally next door to Rome. So the popes were always very careful. But this was technically their own fief, right? To not to let the Southerners influence their own papal policy and marching on Rome, as it had happened with the Normans, which had also considered the wars, the same papal invasions of the Kingdom of Sicily under Frederick II, and still during, as we'll see, Manfred's rule. So it was a quite turbulent and agitated situation. There were different, let's say, interests at stake because historiography has generally stressed the grandeur, the greatness of both. In this case, let's say both Frederick II, of course, which is well deserved, is also of Manfred, but let's say probably overestimating much the actual grip that these rulers had on their own country. Right, the Kingdom of Sicily passes as the most advanced, the center of the Mediterranean, this great Platonic culture in the court, the literary, technical, scientific advancements, and so on. But at the test, of fact, let's say, the Sicilian rulers, even though they could sound at this point with Frederick II, they were also Holy Roman Emperor, King of Jerusalem, so also, an enormous figure aside from just like a local monarch, but hadn't quite managed to, for example, make a successful Italian policy, right? Taking over the rich cities of the center of the north would have fundamentally brought the empire to own an enormous wealth that surely would have been enough to secure control of both Europe and the Mediterranean altogether, reunifying West and East and so on. So, but the papal policy and the resistance of the Lombard leagues and so on proved in many ways that the moral and material forces that could be properly deployed by these opponents were somewhat too strong, right? They were too much in order to have reason of them to taking them over. This had been in a sense evident since Frederick I, but even though he had come the closest at that point to subdue the Italian city-states, in Frederick II's time, the situation was already it was similar to that, but it was also more complicated altogether and quite tormented on its own. And gradually, all these events, think about, as you were saying before, the disruption brought by the Papal Army, while Frederick was in the Holy Land, this broader, propaganda machine that was put together to contrast, the emperor that was seen as Satan himself. Think about all the Joachimites prophecies of the Antichrist. All the, had become a sort of, that there was a strong radicalization of political ideology at the time, and that, if you look at a figure like Manfred, it was definitely even able to exploit it in their own regard. The same Angevins were able to do that, because that's mostly what from the papal side had been produced consistently, but naturally also from the imperial one. But let's say that there were different interests properly within the same Sicilian kingdom, right? From one side were the Siculo-Norman barons that, after all, had received this Swabian dynasty by dynastic ties with the marriage of Henry VI with Constance of Hauteville, and had witnessed, of course, the what this concretely meant in those strained moments in which they also procured by themselves, of course, in which the house had to affirm its royal power, bringing in German elements, mostly mercenaries at this point, that had settled, somewhat carved their own seigneuries within the same Sicily, and there was all an establishment. It was mixed. There were a lot of intersection in this regard that, of course, was essentially negotiating their own autonomy with the new monarchs, right? And this would be a dynamic that a much more even dynamic. The more this dynastic successions would increase. It was true for the same Angevins when they settled. Essentially, Manfred and his German mercenaries were betrayed by the Sicilian barons in that regard. I mean, they even had an important advantage over Charles of Anjou, and yet the system collapsed from the within, and that also tells you how that power policy and its costs, and also the iron fist and the always the sense of treachery and betrayal that stood between both sides, the king and the nobility, could wear out, right? A system like that despite having been the most centralized of all the Latin Germanic kingdoms, and having a great juridical and administrative tradition, etc., by late Swabian times, especially, in spite of the best efforts of Frederick II, but especially under Manfred, wasn't quite the same functional system it had been in the past, and the signs of of this kind of collapse were even at that point, right? The Angevins and later the Aragonese would have essentially to buy to contract their settlement, because there was no way essentially to do it with the local barons, opposing that policy. So it was a very complicated situation. Manfred is being, of course, read as as the last effective Swabian, even though it was a natural son eventually, recognized as a legitimate one, that made essentially made anything, right, factually as a ruler, right, that the young Conradin, on behalf of which Manfred was the legal heir of the Kingdom of Sicily, and on behalf of which, in fact, his uncle Manfred was ruling on the same Sicily and trying also to usurp the throne for that, as he did, right, with also kind of a shady kind of mechanism that we will see now, was too young. Eventually, he went very close to recover the Sicilian kingdom. The history of Europe would have been extremely different, right? Even if the Angevins hadn't carried out that flank, that concealed, that ambush fundamentally at the Battle of Tagliacozzo and so on. But Manfred but he was too young, right? He was just not particularly powerful. Manfred is the last Swabian in a sense, and in many ways it was said that all the historical figures of the time actually recognized, independently from the political alignment, this was quite honest, that being the case also for Frederick II. Everybody recognized the capacities of this man, right? He was said to be the most similar to his father, Frederick, like this blonde, like strong, brave, the chivalric embodiment of the universalistic myth. He was an educated individual. He studied in Paris and in Bologna. He had a lavish court with that had inherited the grandeur of the one of his father, the Stupor Mundi. And yet, historiography agrees that among all the various Frederick's children, that none of them actually had his same magnanimity, his same greatness and capacity. So Manfred has become kind of a tragic hero, also because of his death. We'll see it today. We stop to the arrival of Charles of Anjou, and so just before the invasion of the Sicilian kingdom. But what happened to him? I mean, he died heroically at the Battle of Benevent, when he was at that point betrayed by his barons, was killed, and there was a ferocity, in fact, even in there, the story of his corpse. The Angevins actually were pious enough, to recognizing Charles of Anjou as a Capetian, brother of Louis IX, had recognized the value, the chivalric courage and consistency of this man, and had wanted him buried, at least, with just putting stones on him close to the bridge where the battle had taken place. Instead, the Bishop of Cosenza had him, unearthed once again, and his rests were, dispersed, like, because there was really an extreme level of ideologism in this, and as Manfred had embodied that kind of centralistic policy that, of course, the barons were totally opposed to, right? The reason why the Swabian, you may wonder why the Hauteville, when it went extinguished, they chose essentially a German to rule, while just a local baron, one of the Siculo-Normans, could have simply, taken over, right? Think about Tancred of Lecce, that had taken over in the same way before Henry VI fought in order to reestablish control. Well, the reason was exactly that the Hauteville themselves had, as any medieval dynasty, this obvious recognition that the greatest enemies of the kingdom were the nobles, right? So it was more preferable to continue, right? There was seen nothing wrong in that, because it was truly the blood ties that mattered dynastically. To have the Hohenstaufen ruling in the kingdom, then making the nobility taking over. And so it had happened. So there was this inherent tension between these two elements. So it's a tragic figure. He's one of those characters that is also being neglected. I think I've never heard or watched anything about Manfred of Sicily. Instead, it's one of the great figures of 13th century Europe, and I'm pretty surprised that there's not been such such a coverage of him. In any case, the situation was interesting because the German and Italian policies were collapsing after the death of Frederick II, right? The same Conrad, as we've seen, had dramatic problems, even from the last years of Frederick II, from 1248, already William of Holland had been proclaimed king of the Romans. The situation was really going towards privatization. In Italy, the city-states had fundamentally, reinforced dramatically their power, actually, after the pressure posed by the wars against the Lombard League. They had boomed further and starting also fighting among each other. So much of this international situation actually gets down to the balance between the Italian communes and what fundamentally they could essentially call in to solve the matter. So Sicily, in a sense, represented Sicily was out of the empire. Let's stress this, and independently from the Hohenstaufen ambitions, and in a sense also to some advantage, it was not part of the Holy Roman Empire, right? And it had a much more unitary and tradition, as we've seen institutionally, administratively, than Germany or than Italy, that were hopelessly fragmented. So here Manfred found himself to rule, right? He had supported his father in his policies. He was he was a valid ruler in his own way. He was essentially the son of probably a southern Italian noblewoman, right? Bianca. Some say it's of the Lancia family, but we're not really sure. But let's say he was a person that also embodied that kind of local attachment to the land. That Frederick II was known as the poor Apulia, and he had a very specific predilection towards his kingdom of Sicily, a bit like, I don't know, the Normans would have had for England as opposed to their original French territories, because it was literally the land that had been created, if you want, for a single dynasty to rule, right? Even though as a papal fief, but still something this where they could carry out a very different policy from the one they were habituated to do in the much more autonomistic oriented Holy Roman Empire. So Manfred took on him, given the minority of Conradin, right, of that still maintained the formal suzerainty on Sicily, the say Frederick's legacy, right, Frederick II's legacy. And quite shrewdly, in 1258, Manfred made fake news circulating about the death of Conradin in order to take immediately and decisively the crown, right? There had been a lot of things going on, because initially he wasn't so firm in his power, not just because of what had happened with Conrad, but also because the same barons and the same German mercenaries had fundamentally sided with different actors here. the German mercenaries here were the bulk, factually, of Manfred's army, because here it's all the moment in which the feudal system in the same Sicily had on on paper an impressive amount of knights, right, in medieval Europe, by medieval European standards, and also a very good system of recruitment, well, had collapsed, right, as a system, and the way now was paying the troops, and most of these people were fundamentally, in fact, German mercenaries come as adventurers, right? Also, probably as an external force, as we have seen, as opposed to the Sicilian barons. So this German mercenaries first sided with the Papacy, then sided with Manfred, and in fact the decisive factor on the long run was probably the fact that the Papacy was trying literally to invade Sicily and to fragment it, right, and to in fact control certain nobility, to prevent Montford to rise to much of a greater power, because they knew that, as it would happen, in fact, a policy of power by side of Manfred would have easily intervened in the struggle between Guelphs and Ghibellines within the Italian communes, and that the church that was in between would have suffered of it, and they really did risk, as at some point Manfred was about to overthrow the Papacy from Rome because of the support of the Roman nobility. Manfred had negotiated with the Pope more than once the Sicilian crown. The Papacy had legitimately said, no, dynastically the crown belongs to Conradin, and therefore no, you really can't. It would have been objectively odd for the Papacy to buy it, in that sense, the Sicilian crown for Montford in exchange of submission. There were some orientations. At the end of the day, the German mercenaries understood that they really didn't have by themselves the power to oppose to Manfred at that point, that had reinforced significantly his position as the Sicilian barons began to fear the papal interference compacting with him, so they also sided with him. And those German mercenaries, as we'll see, were very important also in Italy, because let's say German mercenaries in Italy had always kind of existed in a sense. Think about even the Battle of Civitate, like when the Swabians that fought from the side of the Papacy and the Lombards were defeated by the Normans. Think about the same expeditions of Frederick the First, Frederick the Second, the Battle of Tusculum. There are many instances in which the Germans had we think of the barbarian invasions, right, as a period in history that stopped, but actually certain dynamics of this turbulent and warlike Germany that kept putting out warlike youth searching for fortune in the service of the southern lands that had money to pay them, was always a kind of a constant, right? The German influence was very important altogether, but it would increase importantly, and Manfred is fundamentally the also Frederick II had used important German garrisons in Italy and so on, but under Manfred this thing became kind of almost a permanent army of not too many, like 800 knights settled in Tuscany, that was becoming properly one of the most important strategical areas. Like it was shifting a bit in importance from the strategic balance from Lombardy to Tuscany historically at this point, and that would be in fact so important for financing the same Angevin crusade against Manfred himself, and that produced in many ways that civilization that we know. We made many videos about Dante recently, also for that reason, because it's all deeply rooted in the political struggles that emerged from that time, think about, we will talk about Montepartis now. This was all connected to Manfred policy, the intervention of the German mercenaries and so on. In any case, at this point, from 1258, Manfred power over Sicily and on the entire southern Italy was very steady, right? Albeit, quite soon the kind of the truth about the illegitimacy of his claims on the Sicilian throne shown true, right? And at the point also because of his, power, he was excommunicated by Pope Alexander IV, 1254, 1261, who also reproached him to be prosecuted, which was true indeed, to be continuing the policy of Frederick II for what had concerned the attitude towards the papacy. This was like the papacy was doing basically the same thing, in the opposite direction. So it's like, but at this point, the risk, right, of the papacy being taken over by such rulers was concrete, right, and equally the same papal power was dramatically strong, and it was becoming ever more of a financial one, given the development of the papal curate's administration and so on. And Manfred was looking, quite beyond this, right? First of all, he wasn't interested, of course, in the imperial crown. It would have not made sense, right? He was an illegitimate son. The saying, Caroline was still alive. What could he do? He could go to Germany and overthrow him and imprison him or kill him. It would have made no sense. There was no point in going, spending all those resources. Also to do what, right? To spend an enormous amount of money getting German affairs, abandoning Sicily for a while. No, there were much greater opportunities in the Mediterranean, right? He essentially wanted to carry out his father's policy, not just in the southern kingdom, but all over Italy. And so he intervened decisively, right, in the affairs of communal Italy, where the big money lay. So he connected himself, of course, traditionally with with some cities of Ghibelline nature, say, even though there were many backs and forths, many shifts, factional struggles, but Pisa, Genoa, and Siena that were hell of cities, because not just were some of the major ones, but they were importantly the first two maritime ones that could connect, of course, the Sicilian kingdom to the Mediterranean with the ships, with the fleets and all, right? Pisa and Genoa had been traditionally Ghibelline exactly because they had favored in this sense this greater movements, shippings, and so on that ever since the Swabians had inherited the Sicilian crown were obviously connected from the north to the south, right? Between this cities laid between Germany and Sicily, so they were necessarily important as major ports to even ship troops and all these things. Siena also was emerging as a very important Tuscan banking center, together with Florence. At this point, what is characteristic of Tuscany at this point is the very quick growth that will be accelerated dramatically by the subcontracting of the the administration of the Sicilian grain exports fundamentally. That is how the papacy paid the Tuscan moneylenders to finance the Angevin crusade, and so especially the Guelph Tuscan cities. So that's how Florence rose to an important level of power. But here in the mid 13th century, like, Tuscany was still very much equal in its own nature. There were essentially a bunch of cities that dominated in their own regard, but they didn't. They were still, nobody knew who would have emerged, right? Siena might have become the most important one over Florence. There was no idea yet, right? That there was Arezzo, there was Pisa, there were other Lucca, other centers that could, still make a lot of gains, and still this was the time in which cities could be razed to the ground, right? The wars of the Lombard League, as you know, Frederick I hadn't been surely tender against the Milanese. He had their city razed to the ground. The Milanese rebuilt it from scratch in a few years, that also gives you an idea of probably the amount of resources that these communities had. And the Tuscans were less of like the greatest urban tradition was in the north, was in the Po Valley, right, with Lombardy, with other areas that had just been part of the Longobards administrative legacy. They had an ancient link with each other, military coordination, right? So that's why we talk of the Lombard League most of the time. Tuscany was yet to rise at the same level of organization. It's also a very different geography. It's mostly all hills fundamentally, and so the political picture was much more complex, and therefore there was this extremely ferocious clashes, and also fueled by a middle class, right? Lombardy had never had really a popular government, right? From the in the sense of the lower strata of the population proper, the aristocracy had always counted a lot. In Tuscany, it was a much greater strength of the middle classes, and in fact the type of armies that were dramatically developing also the infantry capacities, in a sense, even though they're probably overrated, because still the Lombards maintained a greater quality even in the later, even up to the early 14th century. But it's the mass, it's the money involved, right, by the single cities who could levy with a much more kind of democratic oriented mentality compared to the north, that brings to a fierce struggle to all the same. And Manfred intervenes quite cleverly in this situation, because he realized that Tuscany could provide for that base of power. This is interesting, because effectively the Angevins, when they took over Sicily, they did the same thing, right? They favored not the Ghibellines but the Guelphs in Tuscany, and that's how Florence became the strategic center of the whole region, opposed to the northern Ghibelline seigneuries. So and also because of an obvious connection, the main problem there was that albeit Manfred was not much interested in Germany, still it was important properly to get the passes, the roads that would connect with the kingdom with the north, right? In between stood the Papal States, by the way. But again, by sea, right, Pisa in general could provide for important ships and for important fleets, and so the mobility to for the simply going past by land the Papal States, and these were crucial assets to control, and therefore, and this was a bit the center of Manfred's ambition, but his horizons, his political horizons, were much broader, right? He properly contemplated a plan of Mediterranean hegemony, right? That at the time was a big deal, and it was, we see how, because he, first of all, the Sicilian kingdom had not, let's say, this monarchy had remained feudal in nature. You know that the first Italian maritime republics actually emerged in the south, but ever since the Romans, the Normans arrived, they put them down, right? Because feudalism wasn't that sympathetic to local autonomies in that regard, or the nobility. So southern Italian ports, especially the Apulian ones connected to the very fertile hinterland, were more like trade centers, right? It was the barons from the countryside that still controlled the cities. So it was not like in the north, where cities were properly city-states with charters, with armies on their own. And yes, there was a communal movement also in the south, but it's much less powerful and also much less documented. It's a bit of one of those things that historiography hasn't still studied yet well, because it does seem that there were at least great capitals involved and so on. This kingdom was a bit of a mess, telling the truth, because it was so big that it was just as a system very difficult to manage, even from the within. So in a sense, the same rulers were starting to, that sense of unitary administrative capacity was going out of the window at that point. It was mostly about the diversification of privileges, of supporting this or that community or whatever. In any case, just geographically, the such Apulian ports were open to Greece, to the Balkans, and in fact, Manfred, for this reason, and the economical interest that existed, across the Adriatic, was allied of those Greek principalities that had survived to the Latin conquest of Constantinople. So, and especially Epirus, as much as Manfred sent military expeditions to support the Epirotes in Greece against the French, and he had married Helen, the daughter of the despot of Epirus. This was an important connection. So you know what we're talking about. It's essentially the westernmost of the Byzantine successor states that maintained, in spite of the Palaiologoi recovery of the empire, still an important political and strategical autonomy. It's important to stress, of course, that the Latin Empire was French in nature, right? It wasn't properly ruled by the same Kingdom of France strictly meant, but I mean that they were internationally from that side of the aisle, right? So they were natural enemies at that point with Manfred, because they were essentially a Guelph power allied with the Papacy and anti-German fundamentally. So also in the Eastern Mediterranean, that was more or less, with all the due distinctions and extremely complicated relations, the dichotomy. Manfred also contributed himself, decisively, together with Genoa, so the naval power, to the fall of the same Latin Empire of Constantinople that had been not just a French but also a Venetian creation. So Genoa was happy of course, the Palaiologoi. As you know, the Genoese were the ones that were providing, in fact, naval power even for the Palaiologoi with the subcontracting of the resources in the various Aegean islands that were left to be administrated by Genoese houses and so on. So that's the other picture, right? Byzantines, Genoese versus Venetians, Latins. Fundamentally, that's the picture there. As I was saying before, the Kingdom of Sicily didn't quite have a massive fleet on its own, right? It preferred to rely, as most European powers, as a feudal power, on the ship landing of the great Italian maritime republics, like Genoa, that at this point was really rising dramatically in power in the Western Mediterranean. In the meanwhile, Manfred allied himself also with James I of Aragon. To the son of whom, Peter III, he gave in marriage his daughter Constance, recurring name of the Hauteville, Hohenstaufen, and in fact her tomb is today's it's in the Cathedral of Barcelona. So what Manfred created was essentially an alliance between Aragon, Genoa, Pisa, and Sicily that would have brought essentially the entire Western Mediterranean basin to become a Ghibelline lake, right? And beyond, as we've seen. And this was a quite sensible thing to do, not just because of the enormous wealth that gravitated around the sea, but also properly connecting with some of the most powerful entities in medieval Europe at the time, and pursuing that universal policy that had been proper of the same Hohenstaufen back in the day. So there is a very important event, militarily wise and politically as a consequence. First of all, in 1260, that is the Battle of Montepartis in Tuscany, where the Florentine army, that was the expression of a, let's say, popular government of bankers and of entrepreneurs backed by the Papacy, was crushed, right, by the Sienese army, supported by the the Ghibelline Florentine exiles, and importantly enough, by the German mercenaries of Manfred. The Battle of Montepartis, we will make a video about the Battle of Montepartis because it's one of the great battles of the 13th century in Europe, and is really remarkable because of the the broader evolution of the tactical of feudal warfare, fundamentally feudal tactics in medieval Europe. There is the importance, maneuver of the German mercenaries that fell from the rear, on the rear of the Florentine army. There's all the betrayal, this fierce clash between, especially the Florentine exiles and their city, because that's also better documented. Of course, we're always better documented about Florence than the other cities. Consider that the Battle of Montepartis has also produced, this may be an interesting anecdote, the only source in the world medieval history of the composition of an army, of a medieval army, right? Because when the Siennese stormed the Florentine camp, they took and preserved the so-called Book of Montepartis. That is basically the list of the Florentine officials, army officials, of the list of all the troops, of all the citizens that participated to the army, and that is a unique source. There is no such a thing in history, and it's the only one. It tells you, by the way, how few we know in general about medieval armies in the first place. And that was eventually recovered by the Florentines in the 15th century when they took over Siena again, and it's a very interesting source that also tells you the opulence, the wealth of these Italian communal armies, and properly the material resources, the large amount of men. What is fascinating about Italian warfare at that time is that objectively the largest battles in Europe were fought there with a frequency and intensity and with a regularity that make the region the most warlike in Europe at the time, the most belligerent. There is no doubt about this either, and yet it's also not very studied, and it is properly not conceived and portrayed, because people mostly stick to the idea of the great kingdoms as just the only thing that matters. But frankly, the city-states could field armies that had nothing actually to desire from the largest powers of the time, and that witnessed a dramatically advanced tactical culture that combined, in fact, these elements, this knightly professional element. In part, the Italians had their own knighthood, as you know. Great part of the struggle of Montepartis was also, as we've seen, between this, right? The Ghibelline exiles were a bit more the aristocratic traditionalists, the oligarchs, that wanted essentially to be framed into an imperial hierarchy, to be co-opted by this great universal powers. Of course, universalism was ending. Instead, the Guelphs were a bit the popular force, the ones of the new rich, let's say, that would eventually take over Florence with the Black Guelphs and so on, and that would shape much, in fact, of our understanding of our modernity, our sense of what a republic or democracy from those times, fundamentally in the Renaissance, would be about. So these are important watershed also in the history of Europe, in the history of Western culture. There are beautiful passages. The Florentine defeat at Montepartis was brutal. Like, the Siennese scored a major victory in this sense, and there is also, Dante talks profusely about Manfred, about Manente of the Uberti, known as Farinata, because he was this fierce Ghibelline leader that was at the head of in fact, Florentine exiles. He was called like that because he had blonde platinum hair, so that he was called like Farinata. That means Farina means floor, and that was an extremely was seen by Dante, in fact, in hell, because he was he places him in hell not much because of an antipathy, because Dante was a Guelph and Farinata Ghibelline, rather because of the radical violence and ideology that was that the Uberti family was brought on. Manente was a very good Christian, right? But eventually after the Angevin taking over of Naples, the Guelphs came back to Florence. Farinata's body was unearthed, and his, from his private chapel and so on, and dispersed and condemned as an heretic, right? So that's why he figures in hell. But that was just pure political propaganda, right? To say that every enemy of the church was an heretic. It has nothing to do with the personal convictions of this man. This figure is of radical importance because, to tell you that the level of political violence that existed at the time, because after the Florentine army was annihilated, there was a council of the Ghibellines in Empoli where the Tuscan Ghibellines wanted effectively to raze Florence to the ground. And Farinata, who was a Florentine himself, said no, right? That we are in charge now there, and that this shall not happen. But they were about to do it, right? They were about to raise the entire city to the freaking ground, right? Just think, the entire Western history would have been different if such a thing had happened. And so Dante, of course, as a fellow Florentine, independently from the political differences, esteemed enormously Farinata for having withstood against also these other leaders who were quite ferociously aggressive. And of course, yes, they were all Ghibelline, but they hated each other's guts because of Italian municipalism and all these facts that every city wanted to prevail. And that's the level of tension. And so the fact that Florence would become Ghibelline for this time, from 1260 effectively to 1266, was essentially opened Manfred the path for a consistent Italian policy. When the Ghibellines came back, entered Florence, so they were essentially, as we've seen, aristocrats, right? They started persecuting themselves, the various political rivals, and they brought to a halt temporarily to the development of the banking power of the city, right? That would have become, in fact, as you know, at the beginning of in a few decades, literally the richest city in the entire world because of those banking activities and the Papal Angevin Florentine alliance. And Siena, in this sense, remained for the moment the first financial center of communal Italy. They had an important textile production. They made banking and so on. And the Sienese capitals are the ones that effectively allowed Manfred to continue his political penetration of the peninsula, in spite of the opposition of some Ghibelline leaders, especially in the north. One of these was Eziolino da Romano, who was essentially a political creation of Frederick II. This guy was actually a Guelph leader initially, who was co-opted by Frederick, who told him, he gravitated essentially in the Trevisan March, so in northeastern Italy, close to the Brenner Pass, right? So that area was strategically crucial for the crossing between Italy and Germany. And since Eziolino was rooted in there, Frederick II offered him to become a giver, and he accepted in exchange for the title of Imperial Vicar. Eziolino passed on to history as an extremely ferocious ruler, but that's even in there a completely false Guelph fabrication. Of course, he was no tender soul either, right? But he was a great leader and military commander who managed, in all this mess, as you understand, also after Frederick II, to maintain a control on the Trevisan March and to, in fact, maintain to rule as a lord of different Venetian cities, meaning Venetian of the region of northeastern Italy. And in 1259, he was essentially taken out. He was killed eventually in battle. He was wounded at the foot with a crossbow bolt and eventually died, septicemia, by a Guelph crusade that the Pope wanted to equate to the ones against the Muslims, to whom the same Manfred participated, right? Because even though he was Ghibelline and kind of, with in strange relations with the papacy, Eziolino had to go, in his view. So he was the Lord of Padua, by the way, and he, in this process, also in Padua, eventually the Guelph, kind of more mercantile, popular-oriented class emerged, right, in northeastern Italy. It's essentially the most important Guelph center in the area, and that would remain a bulwark of Guelphism up to the 10s or the 20s of the 13th century, for that matter. So you understand how complicated the situation was. Manfred also tried to come closer to the Marquis of Montford, was very prominent in Piedmont, in northwestern Italy. He even promised him some marriage ties, bring him from his side. The Marquises of Montford had usually been close to the Hohenstaufen. They had been the men of Frederick Barbarossa back in the day. One of the few properly true feudal powers in Italy that had remained, with this idea of being part of properly of the empire, the feudal hierarchy and so on. As Piedmont, it was a bit of a less urbanized area, and so where still the ancient feudal aristocracy had a strong power. But he also had, the Ghibellines, the Montfred had also urbanized themselves by a certain degree. They were the head of an important urban seigneury on their own, even in Lombardy and other areas. The seigneuries are beginning to appear here. I made a video, in fact, on the Romano, on the Montford, on the Pallavicino, that all emerged in the north as these lordly figures that essentially the same communes chose, right, to maintain a unit of command, a broader form of organization, of military coordination, and so on, and would evolve in something else later on in time. Even the unprejudiced policy of Manfred towards a man like Eziolino is important, because Eziolino, together with other Ghibelline leaders, had reproached Manfred to have essentially been unloyal towards Conradin of Swabia, that at that point embodied all. Truly, you see, Manfred was an illegitimate son in a way, right? So he couldn't hope for a legitimate succession. So Conradin was a bit the living vessel of, let's say, of Swabian mysticism and the empire and all. So these rulers, right, really believed in the empire, right? The Ghibellines especially, they really were ideologized at the point. They were truly loyal to the idea of empire, in spite of their own interests, of course, were changed according, especially in a local base. But the idea that the empire could exist and could make it and could take over these various, the Guelph system was living there. So in a way, all the money that was literally coming out in the region was making the dualism Guelph-Ghibelline much more blurred. But even in here, historiographically, it's always underestimated, right? The Guelphs and Ghibellines have been seen at this point mostly like a product of feudal anarchy. They were just names. There were no values within them. It's actually not true, right? Yes, the Guelphs maybe were not particularly, they actually didn't give a damn about the papacy nor about the French or whatever, but they were just opposed to, to other Ghibelline powers taking over. But the Ghibellines really believed in this, and there was a broader understanding that, after all, yes, the empire was still the legitimate authority, and that there were opportunities for all those who would rise, as imperial officials, essentially as vicars. In fact, the aforementioned lords in Lombardy were all essentially an imperial creation. So there was a lot of Ghibellinism in this idea of the faculty of command of even over these cities, of this aristocracy, of this superiority. It was essentially this local Italian oligarchs to be, co-opted by higher power, right? That is a policy that would continue long after, up to the Renaissance and beyond, if you want, because at the end of the day, the ideology remained, and up until the empire existed, and these elements were always subjects of the empire. After all, so Manfred at this point was at the peak of his power, as we've seen, and it was, however, because of his great political fortune that between 1258 and 1261, to pave the road for the setting of his good star. And some it's always like this, right? When a faction becomes too powerful, generally speaking, even those who were kind of in favor tend to gather support to the point of saying, this must end in one way or another. And Manfred had been so successful to be able to attract from his side the Roman aristocracy, making himself elected at the guidance of the Commune of Rome with the title of senator, and threatening thus the Pope within his own capital. This is a very interesting maneuver he made. There was a lot of war going on. Rome was like a mess. Like, it was essentially, it wasn't a particularly large city at this time, but it was still kind of rich, right? The only problem is that because of papal presence, it hadn't quite developed as properly a city-state, as a parallel city-state to the papal power. That had somewhat curbed it. So there was mostly this baronial rule of this very wealthy and powerful and especially warlike Roman leaders who had a broader involvement even in the broader central Italian affairs, and then a popular element that still kind of lived with some forms of military organization and having their things. Especially the Roman people was radically violent, and basically nobody managed to control it ever. But Manfred, was, in a sense, because of the imperial ideology, Ghibellinism, and so on, this senatorial title, the Roman legacy of the city, unavoidably in a classical sense, it somewhat was a presentment, a prodrome of the experience of Cola di Rienzo, and this classicism stressed as Rome that had fundamentally to come back to be the capital of the empire, which is what the Swabians had always struggled for, right? As we often say, that the broader political plan of the Swabians was to rule the world from Rome, right? They were already doing it fundamentally. Their preferred center was Palermo, for that matter, but from the Mediterranean. And of course, Rome had ruling from Rome would have meant the Papacy subjugated, and all the rest of the world being around in Europe and the Mediterranean, and so this privileged central position. And so the ideology there, the threat posed to the same papacy within the same city was enormous. And at this point, much greater forces began to set in motion, right? In fact, Pope Urban IV, 1261-1264, availing himself of a right acquired since the 11th century and abolished only in the 18th, that is to say, properly the one that, in force of which the King of Sicily was properly a vassal of the Holy See, right? Because the Pope had fundamentally created that kingdom, had given the permission to the Normans to carve that, to create that, and given the title even before, right, of ruling on Sicily, even before it was conquered from the Muslims, that it did, in order to tie it to papal control, right? So it was properly, Sicily had always that connection with the papacy, but since an older time, right, since Roman times, so the huge estates were there, and also in southern Italy and so on, there was a very strong interference, let's say, between and also in the other direction, right, with the Normans into Rome and so on. So Urban IV proclaimed Manfred deposed from the throne, right, because it was factually a private possession of the papacy, ideally, and therefore it entrusted the the crown to the brother of Louis IX of France, the quite capable and unprejudiced Charles of Anjou, Count of Provence as well, so very, just ready for a Mediterranean policy. The Italian affairs were so upsetting that even Louis IX, that traditionally hadn't wanted to interfere with Frederick II and the papacy because he thought in the unity of all Christian peoples and so on, kind of gave green light to his brother to accept the papal to respond the papal call and crusade against Manfred. And so we will see tomorrow, I think, how things went. Charles of Anjou risked a lot, right? He managed to elude the Sicilian fleet to land to Rome. He was in dire straits from a financial point of view, but he would manage to invade and defeat, to invade Sicily and defeat and kill Manfred at Benevent. And so that's another massive watershed of the situation. And what else can we say about this? I would stick to that just to stress how important properly Manfred policy and range of influence properly was, especially in Italy, in the Mediterranean, how successful in a sense and concretely powerful that this even the threat against the papacy had been. Right? That makes you understand also why the thing is and the way they did. There would be actually a lot to say more. I'm missing something now that I think about it, but well, no, we'll see that. But I'm glad that we could talk about Manfred, and surely we will do it again in the future, because it's really a deserving figure that, again, most people, I presume, I don't even know whether they actually know. You see, when I'm making, I don't know if you noticed this, but I have resumed, given that I'm re-uploading some of the older videos. Now it's pretty boring, telling the truth, but I like now to do a bit more, I stopped the random cycle that I will retake some time, but I'm making videos on very specific topics that I realize I had never covered, and that I think are very important. I know that I see, at least through the analytics, that you tend to like these more general topics, because sometimes we get lost in the minutiae, but fundamentally these are the big chapters of medieval history. These are really the things that mattered, and I realize all the time when I see around it, popular culture doesn't give a damn about this. Like, again, as I said before, I've never seen anything about Manfred on YouTube, right? The properly the awareness even of self-satisfied, let's say, self-satisfied medieval passion. Sometimes you realize that they don't really know. It's medievalism. It has nothing to do with medieval history. They don't know medieval history. They don't know what it was about concretely. Right? It's just a sort of strange fanboyism towards some flags or colors of, in exaltation of certain things that, I don't know, they saw in video, they learned of in video games. These things they don't tell you, right? Because they I don't know why, right? There is a passion for this or that thing that derives eventually from an historical interest. There is something else behind that. It's history because it's still something about the past, and it's good that at least there is maybe some interest in that regard. But when you realize what can be the positive application of this through the actual understanding of real history, you realize that it's insignificant, it's inconsistent, it doesn't go anywhere. These are the things that we must recover from the past, because they are the ones that molded the world as we know it today. And yeah, well, we will go on and we'll see eventually what happened with Manfred, which I already told you, but and especially with poor Conradin, but that's another story yet again. Anyhow, for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.